I wish I could say that it just left completely, but no, there are times when I still do have the old compulsions.
You've just heard the haunting reflections of Jeffrey Dahmer, a name emblematic of one of the most chilling chapters in criminal history. Today's exploration is an analysis to understand the mechanics of a deranged mind. Our goal is to seek understanding of this complex topic without sensationalism, approaching this sensitive subject with the utmost respect and thoughtfulness, with a view to educate. The narrative of Jeffrey Dahmer is one of psychological anomalies, obsessive compulsions, and a profound disconnect from human empathy. In this episode, we'll delve into Dahmer's perspective on his own actions. What can his words tell us about the sinister forces that drove him?
I desensitized myself to it. I don't know, I went to great lengths.
I began by asking what he wanted from the men he picked up.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
Dahmer's desire to keep parts of his victims unveils a macabre effort to establish a lasting connection with them, literally possessing them and ensuring they cannot leave him even after death. This was likely driven by his deep-seated fears of abandonment, characteristic of his borderline personality traits, transformed into a pathological form of possession to ensure he'd never be abandoned.
And that's why you killed them?
Right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
This is very interesting. Dahmer states that he wasn't angry with them and killed
because I wanted to keep them with me.
While it may sound strange, this is supported by what he did with the bodies in terms of attempting to create zombies by acidic lobotomization and his plans to create an altar of his victims. Both pathological attempts to avoid abandonment and maintain some sort of twisted relationship with his victims. Dahmer also described viewing his victims as objects, a viewpoint which made
it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
That last sentence is important because not only does it demonstrate that there was some inner tension within Dahmer to committing his murders, but it also shows that he knew that the murders were wrong but did them anyway. This inner tension is in keeping with his relatively low psychopathy score compared to other serial killers, like Ted Bundy. His acknowledgement that he knew what he was doing was wrong demonstrates one of the main reasons why he couldn't successfully use the insanity defense at his trial.
You do sound, though, like the kind of person who could have said to himself, "This is wrong. I must stop."
I always knew that it was wrong, but after the first killing was not planned. I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete control and dominance over him.
Dahmer's transition from fantasy to actual killing is indicative of a classic pattern in serial killers. This escalation from imagined scenarios to real-life actions highlights the dangerous potential of unchecked pathological fantasies. Dahmer's first victim was Stephen Hicks, whom he picked up as he was hitchhiking to a concert and impulsively killed.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
This is because of the extreme care he took in disposing of Hicks' body, eventually dissolving it with acid and crushing the bones with a sledgehammer. This is characteristic of an organized serial killer. Dahmer's serial killer profile is interesting because at various times he displays both highly disorganized and highly organized behaviors. I'm thinking of exploring that more in a later video in which I'll go through Dahmer's upbringing, crimes, and psychopathology, and where he falls in the gallery of serial killers. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. After this murder, Dahmer joined the army but was discharged because of a drinking problem. It was 9 years before he killed again.
What happened to you in the 9 years in between that you were able to stop, that you were able to control yourself?
It just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then. And I started, when I moved to Milwaukee in '81, I started reading pornography, going to the bookstores. Eventually that led to frequenting the gay bars. And then one time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. Had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here, was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory
I
of
have
it?
no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
Dahmer's lapse into his old patterns after a period of inactivity highlights the depth of his compulsions. Despite his intentions, his underlying psychological issues resurfaced, leading to a resurgence of his homicidal behavior. He wasn't capable of stopping himself from killing.
When you killed these men, afterwards, were you repulsed? Were you upset?
No, at the time it was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation.
Dahmer describes the rush many serial killers experience here very well. It was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. But more striking to me is his statement that I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation. In any relationship, if one's partner's needs aren't being met, they may leave. In a twisted way, by killing his victims, Dahmer removed the possibility that they'd have any needs he would fail to meet, thus removing any motivation for them to leave him, leaving aside the fact that as they were dead, they couldn't leave him in any case. By killing them, he assured himself of total control and that they'd never leave, in spite of his marked inability to form healthy relationships and meet partners' needs. Dahmer is speaking directly to the psychopathology underlying his motivation to kill, keep mementos, and even consume parts of his victims. After all, to some pathological ways of thinking, there is no deeper way to make someone a part of yourself than to literally consume them and incorporate them into your own body. Dahmer isn't the first serial killer to tread this pathological path of thought.
Why did you photograph them?
It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep if I couldn't keep them there with me whole, at least I felt that I could keep their skeletons. And I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with the 10 different skulls and skeletons.
Dahmer's fixation on physical beauty and the creation of an altar point to a pathological need to possess and retain control over them, even after death. The physical beauty aspect was very important to Dahmer. According to a study by Kenneth A. Bennett, Jeffrey Dahmer had a specific type when choosing his victims, focusing mainly on their facial structure. Most of his victims were young, males of color, around 24 years old, who shared strikingly similar gracile facial features, what Dahmer considered beautiful and unattainable for him absent murder.
And what was the purpose of the altar going to be?
As a sort of memorial. A point where I could, I don't know, it's so bizarre and strange, it's hard to describe. A place where I could collect my thoughts and feed my obsession.
The altar can be interpreted in different ways. I think it is most likely to have been intended to be a place he could go to be near his victims and reassure himself they'd never leave him. For a personally insecure, sexually inadequate killer, such an altar must have promised to be a great source of psychological reassurance.
When the bodies were still in your apartment, there was no time when you would see them and say, "This is grotesque. What have I done?"
There were times, but the compulsive obsession with doing what I was doing overpowered any feelings of revulsion.
Another common theme among serial killers, the compulsion to feed the pathology within themselves is so strong as to overpower most lesser drives, causing them to kill again and again and again. Not only does the compulsion drive the murders, but it frequently drives an increasing pace of murder, as can be seen in the timeline of Dahmer's killings, where a clear acceleration of the pace of murders can be seen as time progresses.
Before you went out to pick up a man, was there any kind of ritual you went through?
I'd go to the nightclubs, drink, watch the striptease shows, and if I didn't meet anyone at the bars, I'd go to the bath clubs and meet someone there, offer them money, and we'd go back to the apartment, have a few drinks. I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. Person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
Watching the movie Exorcist 3 was also part of his ritual. It put him in the mood for murder.
I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape.
Did you like feeling evil?
No, I didn't. But I had tried to overcome the thoughts, and it worked for a while, but eventually I gave in.
Dahmer's ritualistic behavior before his crimes points to a deep-seated need for control and preparation. He attempted to satisfy himself with voyeurism, alcohol, and movies, but found those insufficiently fulfilling, and so felt he had to act out his fantasies in real life.
While Jeffrey Dahmer may say things today that make it seem like he understands what went on in his mind, he does not. All he can do is tell you what happened, but he cannot stop whatever it is that drove him to kill in the first place.
Do you still feel those same urges? Do you still feel that compulsion, that obsession?
I wish I could say that it just left completely, but no, there are times when I still do have the old compulsions.
I think this is Dahmer being very honest. Even in prison, he continues to have the same urges to possess others completely, even after death. Without addressing the underlying psychopathology, serial killers like Dahmer will never outgrow their pathological desires. And of course, many of them don't ever want to outgrow their pathology.
I started having these obsessive thoughts when I was about 15 and 16, and they got worse and worse.
What were your fantasies about?
They were sexual fantasies of control, power, complete dominance. They became reality. There was excitement, fear, pleasure, all mixed together.
It is a great pity that the interviewer didn't ask a direct follow-on question about whether what he wanted was control and power, or whether what he really wanted was to avoid a sense of lack of control and lack of power. These really aren't quite the same thing, and I think Dahmer was more driven by a fear of abandonment and lack of control and power than he was by the obverse. One other thing to note is just how emotionless he is when discussing his motivations. There's a real lack of any emotional connection, whether positive or negative, to what he is describing. It reminds me a lot of psychopaths and forensic schizotypal patients I've reviewed.
I was branching out. That's when the cannibalism started, eating of the heart and the arm muscle. It was a way of making me feel that they were a part of me. At first it was just curiosity, and then it became compulsive. Then I tried to keep the person alive by inducing a zombie-like state. By injecting first a dilute acid solution into their brain or hot water, and it never did completely work.
4 of Dahmer's victims killed in 1991 had holes bored into their skulls, through which Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid, or, later, boiling water, into the frontal lobes in the hope of inducing a permanent, submissive, unresistant state. He essentially was trying to amateurishly lobotomize them with acid or hot water. This was doomed to fail and proved fatal to those he experimented on, although this was not Dahmer's intention. One of the interesting aspects of his desire to create zombies is that he clearly viewed living, but zombified victims as superior to dead victims whose remains he kept. I believe this supports the conclusion that his real goal wasn't the killing, but ensuring that those he found attractive would never leave him, no matter how pathologically he had to act to ensure that.
Could someone like you be stopped? Could you be helped?
No, I was dead set on going with this compulsion. It was the only thing that gave me any satisfaction.
Again, I think, a very honest response. While theoretically with the right therapeutic interventions to address his deep-seated psychological issues one could hope for recovery, in practice this isn't practical, and the solution is to catch these predators, convict and jail them.
I kept the mummified head and skull of one of the victims in a carrying case in my locker at work.
Were you almost flaunting it?
Yes, but that's how strong the compulsion was. That's how bizarre the desire was. I wanted to keep something of the person with me.
Do you know what started it? Was there any kind of incident that you can remember?
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.
Compare this to Ted Bundy's last interview analysis, and you can see that Dahmer takes far more personal responsibility without equivocation than Bundy ever does. Why is this? Well, I think Dahmer was clearly a very unwell man, but he wasn't a psychopathic expert manipulator like Bundy, and so he came to a very different risk-benefit analysis once caught, and decided to be markedly more honest once caught than Bundy. With that said, his failure to highlight how his childhood upbringing impacted his development is an omission, as it seems clear from his history that his upbringing directly impacted his ability to accept his own homosexuality. This unresolved conflict played a role in preventing him developing healthy relationships. Now let's listen to a section of Tracy Edwards' testimony. Edwards was a man who escaped from Dahmer.
He was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point. I hit him and I ran.
What was the turning point for you that made you suddenly realize that you had done something terribly wrong, something you should be sorry for?
It was the night of the arrest. I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim. They asked me where the key was to the handcuffs. My mind was in a haze. I sort of pointed to the bedroom, and that's where they found the pictures. And they yelled, "Cuff him." And I was handcuffed. And it was just the realization that There was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore. The best route was to help the police identify all the victims and just make a complete confession.
This is a very different thought process than that exhibited by Bundy and many other serial killers who continue to hoard knowledge against future opportunities to leverage this for better treatment and just for the sense of power that knowing something others don't gives them. One could also argue it is an example of the sort of black and white thinking seen in borderline and schizotypal personality disorders.
Were they racially motivated
It was
crimes?
not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find.
Predominantly targeting adult black males, Dahmer's selection was far from arbitrary. Instead, research has uncovered a disturbing pattern in Dahmer's victim profile. By meticulously measured cranial dimensions, a chilling consistency that pointed to a targeted selection based on specific craniofacial characteristics was unearthed. Dahmer preferred victims with gracile features. Gracile features refer to physical traits that are slender, delicate, or finely structured. When used to describe facial characteristics, it includes a smaller, more refined jawline, less pronounced brow ridges, and a generally more delicate bone structure compared to more robust or rugged features. Essentially, Dahmer had a type, and that type was based more on his victims' facial and bodily characteristics than their race or orientation. I've provided a link to the research uncovering this in the description and pinned comment.
While you just heard him say that his sexual preference had nothing to do with the killings, he has not come to terms with his homosexuality.
Never understood it. There was no use trying to fight it because I couldn't rid myself of it. It was too powerful and persistent.
Do you dislike it?
Yes, it's caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of conflicts and unanswered questions.
As a general rule, any inability to come to terms with a major component of oneself, such as sexuality, is going to create very significant psychological issues in people. Most may struggle with these issues without it ever rising to the level where they actively seek to hurt others, but in some, their inability to come to terms with themselves can result in many forms of pathological coping, such as outward projection of their own anger and disquiet with themselves, the creation of a double life, etc.
If you were out on the street now, would you still be committing the crimes?
Probably. If this hadn't happened, there's no doubt I probably would be. I can't think of anything that would have stopped me.
Another very honest answer. Without anything changing in his underlying psychopathology, it is simply unreasonable to imagine his behavior would change. It is clear that he simply doesn't have the capacity within himself to remedy the major issues within himself which drive him to kill. The only remedy to him continuing to kill was for Dahmer to be captured or killed. Jeffrey Dahmer's actions place him in the rare and disturbing category of an organized, lust serial killer, despite the fact that at times he was disorganized and impulsive. These individuals are notorious for their meticulous approach to their crimes, planning every detail and going to extraordinary lengths to avoid capture. Dahmer was no exception. His systematic choice of victims and careful evasion of law enforcement are hallmark traits of this category. His horrific acts were not just driven by a need to kill, they were deeply intertwined with perverse sexual fantasies, including necrophilia and cannibalism, making his case a study in the darkest recesses of human desire. Dahmer's psychological landscape was an entangled web of disorders and malformations. He exhibited a range of paraphilias, unusual and extreme sexual desires that were central to his heinous actions. His struggle with addiction deepened his already dark psychological canvas. Yet Dahmer's mental state was more layered than just a confluence of disorders. He displayed traits of Asperger's disorder, part of the autism spectrum. But we all exhibit traits of various disorders. It doesn't mean we have them, and Dahmer was never diagnosed with any autism spectrum disorder. It's crucial to emphasize that autism spectrum disorder does not drive one to violence. Dahmer's actions are his alone. As ASD is a very misunderstood disorder, It should also be stated that those with ASD are less likely to commit violent crimes than the general population, although this difference appears to largely disappear for crimes which can arise out of failures of social understanding such as stalking and harassment, where those with ASD can appear as failed suitors. He also showed signs of borderline personality disorder, which added to the volatility of his emotions and relationships. His psychological makeup also included a mix of schizoid, antisocial and schizotypal traits, illustrating a detachment from societal norms, lack of empathy, and engagement in a distorted reality. Schizoid personality disorder involves detachment from social relationships, a limited range of emotional expression, and a preference for solitary activities. Antisocial personality disorder is marked by a disregard for and violation of the rights of others, while schizotypal personality disorder includes severe social anxiety, thought disorder, paranoid ideation, derealization, transient psychosis, and often unconventional beliefs. It's noteworthy to mention that Dahmer was not a psychopath, scoring 22 out of 40 on the Hare psychopathy checklist, below the threshold for psychopathy in the US. This score, however, is significantly higher than the average for the US population and highlights his significant psychopathic traits. As we reach the end of this journey into the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, we are reminded of the complex tapestry of human psychology and the extreme deviations that can occur. Our exploration today was not just about the darkness of one man's actions, but also about understanding the deeper psychological underpinnings that led to such inconceivable crimes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. By doing so, you'll be the first to know when I release new episodes, offering fresh perspectives on some of the most challenging and intriguing cases in criminal history. If you found today's episode insightful, we invite you to explore more of our content. Discover our in-depth explorations on cases like Ed Kemper, the psychology behind the actions of the killer nurse Elizabeth Wettlaufer, and our special series on understanding the complex nature of psychopathy.